Okay, so now we're ready to do example number 10, and we're going to be evaluating the premises for relevance. So this is step 6, and what I've done, because example number 10 is such an enormous diagram, I've opened up two iLogos files. I'm going to put one over here that'll just hold all of our evaluations. I'm going to make a really big, very wide box here, so that we'll be able to see as many of our evaluations at once as possible. And I'm going to do relevance. Okay, so let's go to a sort of bottom quadrant, if I remember correctly with this diagram. There's a lot over here. Remember that with relevance, and this is going to be a challenge with this particular diagram, we need to see what the premises are giving evidence for. So let's start with this group down here, 24, 25, and 26. Because they're dependent, we have to evaluate them together as a group. But I need to go up and follow this arrow and see what it is giving evidence for. It's giving evidence for the claim that it is acceptable to boo sitting politicians at sporting events. So, do these three premises, are they relevant to the claim that it is acceptable to boo sitting politicians at events? Now, I'm not paying any attention to whether the premises are acceptable or not. Let's see, sitting politicians are even worse, professional athletes are insulated, and it's acceptable to boo professional athletes at sporting events. So what do these two do? These three do? What do each of them do? I'm going to say it is relevant. They are relevant altogether. Premise 24 articulates a similarity between sitting politicians and professional athletes. Premise 25, let me think about this a little bit. It's actually, premise 24 doesn't articulate a similarity. That's incorrect. Claims that sitting politicians are even worse than professional athletes in one particular way. Premise 25 claims that professional athletes are quite bad in that same particular way. And premise 26 claims that it's appropriate to boo professional athletes. I wonder if I missed a premise here, that it's okay to boo people who are insulated from the consequence of their actions. I'm not sure. I'm going to stick with the diagram as it is now, but I just wonder if maybe I missed one. If it's appropriate to boo athletes and politicians are similar to athletes, but even worse in this relevant way, then it's appropriate to boo politicians, which is the claim that these three are supposed to be giving evidence for. So they are relevant. Let's go up here and do 27 and 29. They are supposed to be giving evidence to 28. Sitting politicians choose their position in life. Being in politics includes being criticized, therefore they should expect criticism. I'm going to say these two are relevant. Premise 27 claims that the position that politicians find themselves in is a voluntary one, and premise 29 indicates that that same position necessarily includes criticism, since the fact that the position is voluntary indicates that the politician should have had the knowledge of what the job entailed. Therefore, together, these claims provide relevant evidence to the claim concerning the politician's expectations of the job. Okay, let's do 31. 31, fans can exercise their freedom of speech to cheer or boo. Therefore, other fans are free to cheer sitting politicians if they wish. 31 is relevant. Premise 31 is, how do I put this? More narrow claim than premise 30. It states that fans have at least two options, cheering or booing, which is relevant to the claim that they are free to cheer. Actually, it's premise 30 that's a more narrow claim than 31. So the fact that fans have two options is relevant to the claim that they are free to do one of those options, which is one of those options. Okay, so I've done all these. I've done these. I haven't done 28 or 30. Let's move over a little bit and see what 28 and 30 are giving evidence for. Sitting politicians should expect criticism. I wonder if 28 and 30 are giving evidence to the same thing. Yes, they are. They're giving evidence, and we can put it right there so we can see it. Therefore, it's acceptable. So sitting politicians should expect criticism, therefore it's acceptable. I said it's irrelevant. The mere fact that sitting politicians should expect something does not make that thing acceptable. Sitting politicians may also expect, for example, inappropriate media scrutiny of their personal lives, which may well be unacceptable and reprehensible. Okay, so I think 28 is irrelevant. 30, is 30 relevant? Other fans are free to cheer, saying, no, that's also irrelevant. The fact that other people are free to cheer does not mean that booing is acceptable. Back that up just a little bit more. Cheering, let's see, cheering and booing are not entirely the same thing. That's not right. I don't like that. It is quite possible that cheering may be appropriate in places where booing is not. That's what I want to say. Okay, good. And I think I've done all the premises that give evidence to 23, right? Because there's these three dependent and those two. Okay, so let's start over at 38. The author has yelled at coaches, therefore the author can't critique anyone else for yelling at coaches. Irrelevant. Just because a person has engaged in a certain activity does not mean that they are precluded from critiquing people for that same activity. For example, if a person commits a crime and then sees the error of her or his ways, that person may be in a very good position to speak to other people about why they should not do a similar crime. Okay, 39. The author can't critique anyone. Now I have to assume that 39 is acceptable. Let's say, okay, let's pretend I believe that the author can't critique anyone. Therefore, it's a matter of personal prejudice. I'd say that's, is that relevant or not? Yeah, it's probably relevant. If critique is impossible, if critique of a certain action is impossible, then that action is merely up to individual choice. Critique is only possible if the action in question is not merely can be ethically judged. There we go. Good. 40. Yelling at coaches is a matter of individual conscience, therefore it's acceptable. No, I'd say that's irrelevant. Just because something is a matter of individual conscience doesn't make it necessarily acceptable. Let's see if I can think of an example here. Some people think that, I know I disagree with it, but that, say, paying taxes is a matter of individual conscience, that one shouldn't pay taxes if those taxes are going to something you support. But just because it's a matter of individual conscience, even if you agree with that, doesn't mean it's acceptable to do it. For example, some individuals may consider paying certain kinds of taxes to be a matter of individual conscience. But this doesn't make the choice not to pay those taxes acceptable. It is still appropriate that individuals who do not pay those taxes are held responsible in some way and even punished for not doing so. Great. Okay. Let's go up and do this little portion before going over to this section. Let's do here. 34. Owners of teams put their faces on franchise, assume that's true, therefore they have large egos. That's relevant. The choice to associate yourself so strongly with such a public institution as a professional sports team does indicate a large ego. Okay, now 33, 35, and 36 together. They have large egos, they should be able to tolerate, and owning a franchise comes with getting booed, therefore it's acceptable. I'm going to say these are irrelevant. The mere ability to tolerate a certain action does not make that action acceptable. So it may be true they have large egos, it may be true they should be able to tolerate, and it may be true that owning a franchise comes with getting booed, but that doesn't make it acceptable to boo owners. Okay, so it may be that this owning a franchise comes with things that are not okay, that are reprehensible. So the mere ability to tolerate an action does not make action acceptable, and that really questions, even if all these are true, it questions the relevance of that premise to this premise. Okay, so let's focus on this part of the diagram right now. Let's do 18, 19, and 20. They don't always discipline. If they're not disciplined, the schools and leagues don't do the discipline, says 18. 19 says if they're not, bad things can happen and we don't bad things, therefore we should discipline them. I'm going to say these are relevant. Premise 18 argues that the appropriate disciplining bodies are not fulfilling their responsibilities, and premises 19 and 20 articulate that the effects of the lack of that disciplining are negative. Given that there is a responsibility that is not being met and that the fans care about the negative effects of the absence of that disciplining, someone else needs to meet that responsibility, which is the content of claim 21. Okay, good. Let's see what premise 21 and 22 are giving evidence for. We should discipline the athletes by booing them, therefore it's acceptable. I'd say that's relevant. If booing is an appropriate form of discipline, as premise 21 implies, then it is an acceptable behavior because appropriate discipline is itself acceptable. That's a good example of a little bit of an additional information, or a little bit of an additional claim that does not repeat the premise, but helps to justify why I'm considering it relevant. Appropriate discipline is itself acceptable. That's a good justification. Now how about 22? Home and away players are responsible for their booing because they committed the off-the-field antisocial behavior. Let's say that that's true. If they are responsible for the booing, therefore it is acceptable to boo the players. I think that's irrelevant. The fact that the players are responsible for the booing does not necessarily make the booing acceptable. Consider the negative effects of the antisocial behavior itself. The players are responsible for those effects, but that does not make the effects acceptable. Okay, good. So we've done all of that. Let's go over, I want to see if there are any other lower parts of the argument that we haven't gotten to. No, there aren't. So let's go up and do this little chunk here, starting down here. Okay. 12, 14, and 11. Steroid use is cheating. Barry Bonds used steroids. The Asterix campaign was an honest expression of fan disgust over steroid use. Therefore, they should have allowed the Asterix campaign. Let's assume all of these are true. Are these relevant premises to the fact that they should have allowed the Asterix campaign? And I'd say yes, these are relevant. Premise 12 describes a certain action as cheating, and premise 14 claims that a particular player engaged in that action. Premise 11 describes a certain reaction to that action as appropriate. since premise 10 concerns the official response to that reaction, the three dependent premises are relevant. It matters to the act. Let's see, let me see if I can phrase that. I want to give it a little bit more heft. I'm being a little bit too vague. Major League Baseball should consider the types of claims made in premises 12, 14, and 11 when deciding whether to allow that reaction. Okay, I'm not entirely happy with that, but I'm going to keep going. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Let's get up to here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 independent premises that are giving evidence to 16. So let's do 9 first. There's nothing worse than cheating in sports, therefore it's acceptable to boo cheaters. That's relevant. If an action is damaging to sports, then that's a good reason, that's a relevant reason to boo. Okay, 10. Major League Baseball should have allowed the asterisk campaign against, I say that's irrelevant. Whether or not MLB should have allowed that particular claim, that particular action, has nothing to do with booing. 15. Booing cheaters is not unsportsmanlike. Relevant. Whether an action is sportsmanlike or not should be taken into consideration when deciding whether it is acceptable, since we should not accept anything that is unsportsmanlike. Let's check what 13 is. Cheering cheaters is anathema to sports, therefore it's acceptable. It was irrelevant. Even if cheering cheaters is anathema, that does not mean that it's acceptable to boo them. Silence may be an extremely effective alternative. 14. Booing cheaters is a responsibility of the fans. Again, if that's true, then it's acceptable. So that's relevant. Fulfilling responsibility is always acceptable. Great, so we just did all of that. Let's come on over here and work on this part of the argument here. Okay, so let's start with 46. Scientific research has shown that officials tend to want to please folks in the stands. If that's true, then officials want to please the folks in the stands. Let's say relevant. Scientific research is a good reason to accept a certain claim. So that's relevant evidence. Looks like I'm running out of room here, so I'm going to choose another iLogos file. Put it over here. Start a new box. Okay, let's do 45. 45. Officials tend to want to please the folks in the stands, therefore home crowds have the psychological advantage. I would say 45 is relevant. If one person wants to please another, then the latter has an advantage over the former. Fine. 47, if home crowds have the psychological advantage over officials, therefore it's acceptable. That's irrelevant. Having an advantage over another person does not justify using that advantage in any particular way. It's quite possible that home crowds have this advantage but ought to refrain from using it in the form of booing. Okay, so we've done this. Let's do 44. Officials consider being booed as part of a job, therefore that's irrelevant. The fact that officials expect something does not necessarily mean that that thing is acceptable. Officials also probably expect to deal with inappropriate, let's say with, for example, fans hurling objects from the stands, but that does not make that action acceptable. Okay, so we've done that. Let's go do 42 since we can see it right here. Current broadcasters expect to be booed, therefore it's acceptable. Same thing as what I just said. The fact that current, in fact, I'm going to copy this. Because it's really the same logic. The fact that, I'm just going to change the words. Current broadcasters expect something does not mean that they accept it. Current broadcasters also probably expect to deal with, for example, I need a different example here because current broadcasters don't need to think about fans hurling things from the stands, fans yelling at them in public places, but that doesn't make that action acceptable. Good. Okay, we are making progress. Okay, let's see what 43 and 41 are supposed to be giving evidence for and do them. 43 and 41 are giving evidence for the claim that booing at sporting events is sometimes acceptable. Remember, I have to accept, just pretend that 43 and 41 are acceptable. If it's acceptable to boo a current broadcaster, yes, that's relevant. Premise 41 is giving one particular example of the action described in the conclusion. So, it is relevant to that conclusion. And we're going to see this pattern over and over again. In fact, we can see it in 43. A lot of the first level of premises here are examples of the action that's mentioned in the conclusion. Same thing with 43. So it's going to be relevant. Because it's giving one particular example. And let's see, we might as well find other ones if we know it's going to be, it's the same for 32. Okay, and it's the same for 37. So I've done that, done all of that. It's the same for 16. I'm just going to go ahead and do all of these at this level because I've discovered that the logic is the same. And let's go over here 2 is actually different. Look at premise number 2. I can't use the same logic. Booing poor conduct should be encouraged is not an example in the same way that the other ones were. So let's do 2. If booing poor conduct should be encouraged, then booing at sporting events is something to schedule. That's also relevant, but this is slightly different. Poor conduct can happen at sporting events. So if it is generally acceptable to boo poor conduct, then it is sometimes acceptable to boo at sporting events. And the real additional information is right here. Okay, that this is the reason that is not represented. It's not a premise. I'm not repeating the premise. I'm saying why the premise is relevant, and I'm providing additional information. Okay, let's do this argument over here. Starting with 4, 5, and 7. Coaches have looked the other way in pursuit of victories. Is that relevant to the fact that they've not been booed? I'm going to say that's irrelevant. Coaches don't boo. So the fact that they have looked the other way does not provide evidence for the claim that the athletes haven't been booed. How about 5? Professional athletes turn into maladjusted narcissists. Does that show that they have not been booed? No. They may have become maladjusted narcissists even if they were booed. So the fact that they became narcissists doesn't mean that they weren't booed. Now, I have to do 5 again because 5 is also giving evidence to 6. So they turn into maladjusted narcissists, therefore booing them will keep them. I'm going to say it's irrelevant too. The fact that they became a certain kind of person does not mean they would not have become that kind of person if they had been booed. Okay, how about 7? People are willing to boo their opponent, therefore they should be willing to boo their own team. I'm going to say that's relevant. If there isn't consistency regarding booing, then it would be unfair. To be willing to boo your own team comes with, your opponent's opposing team comes with the responsibility of being willing to boo your own team. Okay, now let's ask if 8 is relevant to 2. I'd say that is relevant. No. That might not be relevant. Let me think. So the claim is people should be willing to boo their own team. Let's say, okay, that's true. Therefore, booing poor conduct should be encouraged? No. The fact that people should be willing to do something does not mean that that action should be necessarily encouraged. I'm trying to think of an example here that helps. That. I'm going to just stop and think about that for a second. But I've thought about this and I've changed my mind. Because I couldn't come up with any example of something I said you should be willing to do this that shouldn't also be encouraged. So I'm going to say it's relevant. To say that a person should be willing to do action X is also to say that action X should be encouraged. For example, If I say that a person should be willing to teach their child how to read, I also am saying that that person should be encouraged to teach their child how to read. Yep, that took some thought. Okay, let's do 3 and 6. 3 and 6 are dependent. Today's star athletes have not been booed since they were children. Assume that's true. Booing athletes when they're young will keep them from being maladjusted. Looks like I'm actually missing an arrow here. It should be like that. Okay. And this is relevant. Relevant. Premise 3 states that today's athletes were missing a particular experience, and premise 6 indicates that that experience will keep them from becoming something negative. Since premise 2 is about the experience that will have that positive effect, 3 and 6 are relevant. Good. And I've done 2. Okay, so I've done this whole section. I believe that I have not done 9, 10, and no, I have done 9, 10, and 14. Yep, I've done all of that. So let me look through and see if I've done all of the premises. I've done all of those premises. I've done all of those premises. I've done all of those. I've done all of those. I believe I have completed step 6, for example, number 10. Yep, okay, that's that.